If South Africans really wanted the land, the first thing we need to understand is the reality of the legislation that exists today. On paper, South Africa has frameworks intended to redistribute the land, but the laws themselves are slow moving, they're complicated, and riddled with loopholes that benefit those already in positions of power. The processes are heavily bureaucratic, requiring multiple approvals and assessments, and even forms of documentation that most communities struggling for access cannot realistically navigate. At the same time, large landowners and corporations are often the ones with the most to lose, which naturally gives them a stake in ensuring that reform is slowed or diluted. This isn't just a question of fairness, right? It's about the practical mechanics of who controls resources and how decisions get made in government. The slow pace of legislative reform, combined with the complexity of land claims, creates an environment where the status quo is maintained and ordinary citizens remain largely excluded from ownership, even when the law is supposed to work in their favor. So, understanding this gap between legislation and lived reality is the first step in seeing why reform has stalled. But the truth is that ordinary South Africans do have power, even if it doesn't always feel like it. Petitions, public hearings, and sustained engagement with local government aren't just symbolic things. They can directly influence policy decisions if organized strategically. Citizens can track who sits on relevant committees, they can attend council meetings, and demand accountability from the politicians who are supposed to implement these laws. The challenge isn't only the legal framework itself, it is how people choose to interact with it. When communities are informed and persistent and united in their advocacy, the momentum shifts and the barriers to reform become more navigable. If the goal is real land access rather than rhetorical debate, the focus has to be on understanding the mechanics of legislation. It has to be identifying who benefits from the delays and engaging in the processes that can move change forward. Reform is not automatic, but it's achievable when ordinary citizens recognize and act on the levers of influence that already exist. If South Africans really wanted the land, the first thing we have to confront is the history that shaped its current distribution. During apartheid, the government systematically removed Black South Africans from their land, forcing them into reserves or marginal areas that were often unsuitable for agriculture or development. So large portions of the country were designed exclusively for white ownership. And this wasn't just a temporary injustice, it was a structural framework designed to concentrate wealth, to limit economic opportunity, and entrench social inequality. The effects did not disappear in 1994. They're embedded in property records, in generational wealth, and economic patterns that persist even today. When people think about land reform as an abstract or moral issue, they miss the direct line between this history and the gaps we see today in income, access to credit, and agricultural productivity. Ownership of land is not simply symbolic. It creates the foundation for wealth creation, for stability, and the ability to leverage resources for business, farming, or housing. Understanding this historical context is crucial for anyone who wants to engage with land reform in a practical and effective way. The lingering effects of historical land dispossession are both measurable and systemic, and they illustrate why reform isn't optional if we want to build a functioning economy. Communities that were denied land decades ago remain economically disadvantaged, and their lack of property limits access to finance, investment, and generational wealth accumulation. This creates a cycle where historical injustice directly translates into current inequality, making it much harder for affected populations to escape poverty or compete on equal footing. Reforming land ownership is therefore not only a question of justice, but a necessity for economic efficiency and national growth. When land is redistributed and made accessible, it empowers communities to produce, invest, and participate fully in the economy. If South Africans truly wanted meaningful access to land, the first step is recognizing that this is not an emotional or symbolic issue. It is a structural economic problem with a clear historical root and a tangible path forward through targeted reform. If South Africans really wanted the land, we'd start by asking a simple and probably an uncomfortable question for most: who actually controls it? Because the truth is, the idea of the government handling land reform is not as unified as it sounds. The process is fragmented across departments like agriculture, rural development, and land reform, each with its own mandates, budgets, and political priorities. The result is now a web of overlapping authorities that slows down decision making and creates space for inefficiency and corruption and political manipulation. Politicians often campaign on the promise of returning land, but once in office, they may face competing pressures from investors, agricultural unions, and even internal party dynamics that shape what actually gets implemented. Then there are private interests and lobby groups who work quietly in the background to protect commercial land holdings, using their resources to influence policy or store legislation that could threaten their assets. So, while the public hears speeches about transformation, the real decisions are often made in committee rooms, budget meetings, and behind closed doors where ordinary citizens have little visibility or influence. But that doesn't mean that the public is powerless. If South Africans really wanted the land, they would engage directly with these layers of decision making rather than only responding to election promises. People can attend public hearings, submit comments during policy consultations, and scrutinize budget allocations for land reform programs. Because these are the points where accountability can still be enforced. Local communities can build coalitions with advocacy groups that understand the technical details of legislation and use that knowledge to challenge inefficiency or corruption in how land is allocated. The mistake is assuming that reform happens only at the top. Real influence comes when citizens consistently pressure these structures from the bottom up, demanding transparency in land audits, questioning delays in redistribution projects, and using media and data to expose who benefits from the current system. The process is going to be pretty slow. That's where sustained civic pressure becomes the difference between rhetoric and actual reform. If South Africans really wanted the land, we'd first need to clear up what we actually mean when we talk about redistribution. Because a lot of the resistance comes from myths, not really evidence. One of the most common fears is that transferring land from large commercial owners to smaller communal farmers will collapse agricultural productivity and threaten food security, right? But this assumption ignores the fact that many redistributed projects fail not because land reform is flawed, but because the state provides little post transfer support. There's no credit, there's no training, and there's no infrastructure. So when land changes hands without a system that helps new owners succeed, of course the output is going to drop. But that's not a failure of reform. It's a failure of planning. In countries like Namibia, Rwanda, and even parts of Brazil, have shown that when redistribution is paired with technical support and access to markets, small scale farmers often outperform large estates in both yield and inefficiency. The problem isn't that redistribution harms the economy, it's that South Africa hasn't implemented it with the same seriousness that it applies to protecting existing capital. Another myth is that land reform only benefits the poor or the unemployed, as if it's a welfare project rather than an economic restructuring. In reality, equitable access to land broadens participation in the economy. It spreads ownership and strengthens the local markets. When land is used productively by more people, it creates jobs, it builds self sufficiency, and stabilizes food prices. That means that redistribution, if done right, does not weaken the system, it diversifies it. The danger lies not in giving land to new owners, but in maintaining a structure where ownership remains so concentrated that millions of South Africans are effectively locked out of producing wealth from the country that they live on. If South Africans really wanted the land, they would stop treating redistribution as a charity or a political talking point and start seeing it for what it is, a logical step toward a more balanced and resilient economy. If South Africans really wanted the land, they would stop treating government promises as the only way change happens. Policy doesn't move because politicians feel generous that day. It moves because citizens make inaction politically expensive. Throughout history, every major shift in public policy has started with organized, sustained civic pressure. Petitions and protests are not symbolic acts. They are mechanisms that reveal the level of public will. When a petition gathers enough verified signatures, it forces committees to at least debate the issue. When protests stay consistent and coordinated, they shift media attention, they alter public perception, and they make the issue unavoidable for lawmakers who depend on votes to stay in power. The problem is that many South Africans protest for a day or they sign something online and expect transformation overnight, but effective advocacy requires persistence and structure. You don't just demand land reform, you track how the issue is tabled, who votes against it, and which department is delaying implementation. Change is not spontaneous, it's engineered, right? Through accountability and organized engagement. If South Africans really wanted the land, they would study how other movements made governments bend. In 2020, South Africa's gender based violence petition forced parliamentary hearings that resulted in stricter sentencing laws. Community driven energy petitions have influenced local municipalities to adopt renewable pilot projects. These were not miracles, they were results of coordination and follow up. The same principle applies to land reform. Citizens can form local advocacy groups, they can use data to build evidence for policy proposals, and collaborate with existing land rights organizations to strengthen their lobbying power. Instead of waiting for a politician to prioritize reform, communities can set the agenda themselves. Democracy only works when citizens use its tools intentionally. Petitions and protests are the starting points, but policy change happens when that pressure is sustained, when it's measured, and when it is publicly visible. The land question won't move through outrage, it will move through organized persistence that leaves the state with no option but to act. If South Africans really wanted the land, they would start treating elections as more than a ritual, and see them what they really are for: mechanisms of leverage. Land reform doesn't fail because it lacks merit. It fails because the people responsible for implementing it face little political consequence for neglecting it. Voting is not just about choosing who governs, it's about signaling what issues carry weight among the electorate. When voters prioritize personalities over policy, the result is predictable. Campaign promises about land redistribution are made loudly before elections and quietly forgotten afterwards, right? But when citizens study each party's actual voting record, when they question their representatives during town halls and track whether land related legislation is progressing through parliament, they create accountability that cannot be ignored. The difference between a campaign promise and a binding policy lies in the political cost of not delivering. The question isn't whether the system works, it's whether voters are using it strategically. If South Africans really wanted the land, they would understand that voting is not the end of engagement. It is the beginning of a negotiation. Local elections, in particular, determine who manages land use, determines municipal zoning and redistribution at the ground level, right? That is where the power to allocate, delay, or block projects often sits. There are examples across the continent where sustained electoral pressure has pushed land reform forward, like Kenya's 2010 constitution, which included land ownership clauses after years of civic organizing that turned voting into a bargaining tool. South Africans could replicate this by aligning civic groups around land-based voting priorities, endorsing candidates with concrete reform plans, and holding them accountable beyond election day. Real influence does not come from slogans. It comes from voters who treat every ballot as a contract, not a hope. If the people truly wanted land reform, they would use their votes not to reward promises, but to enforce performance. If South Africans really wanted the land, we'd have to talk about money, because land reform isn't just a political idea. It's an economic restructuring. The narrative that redistribution destroys the economy usually comes from those who benefit most from the current concentration of ownership. But if you break it down logically, the economy does not collapse because land changes hands. It struggles when new owners are not equipped to use that land productively. That's more of a policy issue, not a reform issue. Studies from the Department of Agriculture and the Land Bank have shown that when smallholders receive proper financing and training and access to markets, their collective contribution to the GDP and employment growth outpaces large-scale commercial farming in several regions. Redistribution in economic terms can be an investment. It's creating jobs through local processing, transportation, and agribusiness services that spring up around smaller, decentralized production hubs. The potential gain is not limited to farmers, even. It extends to entire rural economies that have been stagnant for decades. The real loss lies in the inefficiency of leaving millions of hectares underutilized because ownership remains concentrated in so few hands. If South Africans really wanted the land, they would understand that land reform does not destroy value. It redistributes who benefits from it. I mean, yeah, large landowners and corporations might see their direct holdings shrink a bit, but the economy as a whole gains through broader participation and new streams of productivity. The fear that redistribution leads to economic collapse ignores examples from countries that executed gradual, well supported transitions. Even conservative estimates suggest that a 10% increase in smallholder output could inject billions into rural economies through multiplier effects like new jobs, increased spending, and expanded tax basis, right? The short term costs of restructuring are real, but the long term return is a more balanced, self sustaining economic model. The question isn't whether someone loses, it's whether the country gains more by broadening access to opportunity than by maintaining a system where growth benefits only a few. If South Africans really wanted the land, they'd treat reform not as a threat to stability, but as an investment in shared prosperity. If South Africans really wanted the land, we'd start by studying where it has actually worked, not in theory, not in slogans, but in actual results. Look at countries like Rwanda, which rebuilt its agricultural system after the genocide by redistributing land and supporting smallholder farmers with training and cooperative systems. Or even Ethiopia, where secure land rights helped triple agricultural output over 2 decades. In both cases, reform wasn't about revenge or political performance. It was about national efficiency. They didn't obsess over who owned the title. They obsessed over how to make the land productive. South Africa could do the same by prioritizing secure ownership, affordable access to capital, and agricultural mentorship instead of treating land reform as a once off handout. If we focused less on compensation battles and more on creating sustainable rural economies, we would be rewriting the story of inequality through productivity, not protest. The truth is, successful land reform doesn't happen in courtrooms or campaign speeches. It happens when people see farming as an industry, not an inheritance. Zimbabwe's case shows the opposite. Emotional land seizures without support structures destroy production. South Africa can learn from that too. We have the data, the talent, and the infrastructure. What is missing is a framework built around long term stewardship rather than short term symbolism. If South Africans truly wanted the land, we would stop debating ownership like it is the finish line and start building systems that make ownership actually mean something economically, socially, and generationally. If South Africans really wanted the land, we would stop waiting for Parliament to act on emotion and start learning how to influence it through structure. Lobbying isn't some mysterious elite process. It's the organized version of civic participation. When mining companies or unions want something passed, they don't just complain about it. They show up with data, draft proposals, and consistent representation in committee hearings. That's what makes their voices powerful. Imagine if ordinary citizens did the same. For example, if farmers' associations, land right groups, or even youth organizations coordinated policy submissions, followed bills through committees, and met with MPs to argue for specific clauses. The process is public, it's accessible, and it's built for participation. But because most people don't understand how it works, it's left to interest groups that already have money and influence. Real reform happens when citizens start to compete on that same playing field. Lobbying is not about shouting louder, it's about speaking the system's language fluently enough that you cannot be ignored. South Africans could start small, identify MPs on the portfolio committee for agriculture and land reform, read their positions, and then write informed submissions during public consultation periods. Attend the hearings. Network with advocacy groups that already have legal expertise or access to parliamentary staff, and document everything because transparency builds credibility. The goal is not to demand, it's to design, to craft legislation that reflects not just emotion, but evidence. If South Africans truly wanted the land, we would be spending less time arguing about history and more time mastering the machinery that writes the future. If South Africans really wanted the land, we would treat the next decade like a strategic project, not a political debate. The future of land reform isn't just about who owns what. It's about whether the country can organize itself around long term goals instead of short term outrage. The legislation that decides who gets access to land, how that land is used, and how ownership is transferred will be rewritten several times over the next 10 years. The real question is who will be in the room when those drafts are written? Because if it's not citizens, if it's not the farmers, the youth groups, the rural communities, and the local entrepreneurs, then those laws will continue to reflect the priorities of whoever has the resources to stay close to the process. Every citizen has a role in that timeline, but most underestimate it. Your vote determines which people write the frameworks. Your voice, when organized with others, influences which amendments survive committee reviews. Your participation, sustained over years, becomes the reason certain bills make it to the floor at all. The future of land reform is not something that is decided, it's something that is built brick by brick through civic endurance. What South Africans should be thinking about right now is continuity, not reaction. The reason many reform efforts collapse is because there is no consistent public follow through once the noise dies down. But the next decade will demand citizens who can stay focused, who understand that real reform is less about land seizures and more about policy structures, training programs, and financial systems that make ownership productive. Education will play a critical role here, not just agricultural training, but civic education, how to read bills, how to challenge policies, how to hold your representatives accountable without resorting to protest alone. The most powerful shift that South Africa could make is cultural, moving from anger to authorship. Because if citizens start to see themselves as co authors of the nation's future, not just the spectators of its dysfunction, then land reform won't just be a political talking point. It'll become a working system that finally matches the country's ideals.